This is Podcast Theory.
Hello again, fellow podcaster, and welcome back to Podcast Theory. I'm your host, Jason Sircone, and today it is part 2 in my 5-part series, 5 Things Your Podcast Doesn't Need. If you listen to the previous episode in this series, I talked about the long-winded, worded intro and why your podcast does not need that. And today we're going to expand upon that slightly with another thing that ultimately keeps your listener from getting to the reason they showed up faster. So let's talk a bit about the whole attention span thing real quick. If you go back to the first episode in this series, I talked about this in more detail, but the average attention span of adults in 2024 is 8.25 seconds. Which is absolutely mind-blowing, right? Like we're losing it to the goldfish almost, but here we are. We're inundated with content, and this is something to keep in mind when it comes to podcasts. You know, your listener has more time on their hands because if they click play, they're more than likely in a scenario where they're going to have more time on their hands to consume your full podcast. Now, they're in long-form content mode. They want to listen to something that's going to change the game for them. They've decided your podcast is it. Potentially the art grabbed their attention when they were searching for podcasts. Maybe you hooked them with a great title. Whatever got them in place, you've got them. You want to continue to build on that experience and give them exactly what they showed up for. Now, for me, the golden rule of podcasting has always been listener experience. And these items that I'm covering in this series are things that aren't necessarily a deal breaker for a podcast listener, but it can hinder that experience. And ultimately, the goal is to give them exactly what they showed up for, but get it to them as fast as possible. Because attention spans are shorter, you don't want to run the risk of your audience bailing on you before you get to the important message that's ultimately going to change or transform where they're at in their life. So if you think about this from the attention span side of things, getting them to the heart of the matter, the reason they click play, the reason you got them hooked, maybe it was a great title, maybe it was great artwork, whatever it was, you've got them in place, you want to get them there. So yesterday talked about the fact, or I should say in part 1, I talked about the fact that you do not want to have this long worded intro because it's not necessary. It's not why they showed up. They don't need to hear all of these things that ends up being like a minute and a half of you just talking with some underlying music. They want to get to the heart of the matter. So give them a quick intro. Another thing you do not need, and that's what we're going to dive into today. Part 2, number 2. Another thing you do not need is to read your guest's bio. Now, I've seen this done in a number of different ways, but either way, you do not need to give this full lengthy read of a bio. And I get it. Guests often provide this information. I know when I provide my information, when I'm making a guest appearance, I have my bio short and sweet. It's 2 sentences because I know that podcasters have that habit of reading that bio. I firmly believe that it's much more engaging to get the guest involved immediately and let the guest talk about that stuff. You don't have to read out the bio because the guest is going to tell their story. Because if you start off your show, think about this, put yourself in your listener's shoes. You start off your show with this long worded intro with a little bit of music. It's about a minute and a half in, and then it cuts to you doing a monologue, and you're now reading the guest bio. And that could take a minute and a half, whatever the length of it is, and you're reading it word for word. You might stumble over a couple of words. You might trip up and mispronounce something. There's a number of things that can happen in that scenario. And yes, you can go back and edit, but overall, now you've got this long-winded, worded intro followed by a monologue that's reading a bio that the guest is probably going to end up repeating when you say, tell us about yourself. When things start off, Give us your story. Tell us what you've done. Tell us why you're here. Things like that. When you open up the conversation, the guest is more than likely going to say it all over again. So you don't need to have it in place where it's going to keep listeners from getting to the actual conversation. You just need to set the table in a very brief, succinct way. I covered this on the past episode, but I'll reiterate on this one. Basically, when you start your show, all you need to do is intrigue your listener to let them know what's about to happen. I like to ask a quick question that makes them think, and then I lead into why that guest is going to answer that question for them. And on this episode, we're going to talk about X, Y, and Z. I'm glad you're here for it. I'm going to step aside, let you dive right in. That's it. You make it quick, you let them know what to expect, and you get them closer to that conversation. If you're reading a bio, it takes longer. And again, it's information that's going to be repeated. So you want that intro to be super succinct, or don't even have that. You could literally just have a quick play of music that could be 15 seconds long, much like you hear on Podcast Theory. We kick off with the music, and I'm right into this conversation with you. I want you to get to the heart of the content as fast as possible. Another reason why you don't need to read a bio, and I see this done more often than not, hosts will read the guest's bio while the guest is just sitting there. And if they've given you a long-winded bio, or if it takes you longer to get through it, or if you're in monologue mode where you just want to share as much as you possibly can about that guest, they're sitting there doing nothing. Your audience is listening to you or watching you read through this bio. So if it's on film, on camera and video, they're reading. So you're not looking at the screen, you're looking down at your sheet of paper or whatever you have that has this person's bio information. And then again, once you get through all that, you bring the guest on stage to start talking, and they're probably going to reiterate most of those points anyway. So why bother? Jump right in. I showed up for a damn good conversation. Get it started. Quick intro, have some music. If you want to do a little bullet point of you're going to learn XYZ, that's fine. I like to shoot for a minute to a minute and a half. That's how fast I want my listeners into that episode. Because going back to the big lesson, that's the overarching theme of this entire series. Attention spans are short, my friend. Attention spans are getting worse. And you want to make sure that you're not running the risk of a listener bailing on you. Not saying that's going to happen every time, but the more fluff, the more filler that you put in that isn't needed, the more you run that risk, because you want your audience to get engaged as fast as possible. And the best way to do that is to give them the great conversation that they showed up for. So instead of starting with a bio read, get right to it and start asking engaging questions. Kick things off with something that gets your guest right into the conversation as fast as possible. Give them something that they've never thought about before. Give them something that gets them to tell a story right out of the bat. Have them talk about the most engaging experience they've ever had on a podcast, or what's the most important thing you've ever done in your life that has changed the game for everyone around you. There are ways that you can do this. And I've had podcasts in the past where I've asked the same question of every guest right out of the gates, and to get new perspective every single time. John Lee Dumas on Entrepreneurs on Fire does this as well. When you ask a question to start the conversation, it gets everybody's ears perked up immediately, and that guest doesn't have to sit there awkwardly while you read their bio and give off this list of accomplishments. If you don't do the engaging question, that's okay too. Think of how Joe Rogan does it. There's like a 15-second intro, and then they're right into the conversation. He says, "Hey, what's up?" "Nothing. What's going on, Joe?" Now, his guests and him, of course, they're well known typically, so they don't have to go into a bio of any kind. But if you want to just get the conversation going, you can just start with, "Hey, what's up? Glad you're here today." Start the conversation just like if you were to meet somebody out for coffee or meet somebody for a beer. When you sit down, you just start talking. You just start rolling. This is what creates engaging content that people want to listen to, and they want to listen to from start to finish, because the sooner they're captivated, the sooner they're going to hang on every word. So if you get them to that conversation faster, you're in a better position to keep them in place till the end of your episode. And as they listen to everything, that's when they're going to absorb your full message and feel the full impact of what you're putting in front of them. So get that conversation started faster, get your guest involved quicker, and do not read a bio. You can tee it up for your guest by simply saying, tell us about yourself, tell us your story, tell us why you do what you do and why you're so passionate about it. Your guest is going to give you tremendous content from that point on. That's the point. Let them talk. You brought them on for a reason. Don't make your job harder. Make the conversation much more engaging. Take a little bit off of your plate. But the overall theme here is this. You are getting your listener to that content as fast as you possibly can. I believe that the attention span, the 8.25 second thing, yeah, we're probably all to some degree guilty of losing that attention span in that time frame. But with podcasts, it's a little bit expanded, but don't roll the dice. They clicked play. You got them in. Now you want to keep them there. Get them to the reason they showed up as fast as possible, and the likelihood of that happening increases each and every time. So that is going to do it for today's episode of Podcast Theory. I'll be back with part 3 of this series on the next episode, and I'll be expanding on this again, talking a little bit about the whole attention span thing and another item that's going to easily be removed from your podcast structure that's going to get your listener to the experience that they showed up for. So until our paths cross again on the next episode of Podcast Theory, my name is Jason Sircone. This has been Podcast Theory. Good talk. I will see you out there.